3 in the morning, the edge of the Polish forest. 12 Spetsnaz operators moved through the triple-layered steel fence. They were 5 minutes behind schedule, and the security lights on the perimeter were flickering in a pattern that did not match the mission briefing. The air was freezing, thick with a biting sleet that turned the pine needles into jagged glass. The smell of damp earth and ozone filled the narrow gap between the tree line and the high-voltage wire. The lead climber reached the first barrier. He did not use heavy tools. He used a specialized high-frequency cutter that vibrated at 20,000 cycles per second. The steel parted like wet paper. There was no shower of sparks. There was only the faint hiss of metal separating in the dark. Behind him, the team moved in a staggered line. They were shadows within shadows. Each man carried 60 pounds of gear, including high explosive charges and suppressed AS-Val rifles. They did not speak. They did not use radios. They moved by the rhythm of the man in front of them. Captain Volkov watched the display inside his night vision optics. The world was a grainy landscape of neon green and deep, oily blacks. He saw the heat signatures of the NATO sentries 200 meters to the east. They were huddled inside a reinforced concrete guard shack. Their thermal silhouettes were bright orange against the cold blue of the bunker walls. One of the guards was smoking. The tiny point of light from the cigarette looked like a flare through the infrared lens. Volkov signaled his team to freeze. A NATO patrol vehicle was approaching. It was an armored Land Rover, its tires crunching over the frozen gravel of the perimeter road. The headlights were dimmed to a tactical crawl. The beam of light swept over the patch of forest where the Spetsnaz team lay flat against the mud. Volkov held his breath. The cold mud soaked through his combat shirt. The ice water seeped into his collar. He did not move a muscle. The light passed over them, illuminating the cut in the fence for a fraction of a second. The vehicle did not stop. The engine noise faded into the distance. The team rose as one. They crossed the first 10 meters of the dead zone in 6 seconds. This was the most dangerous part of the approach. This strip of land was monitored by seismic sensors buried 3 feet underground. The operators stepped with a specific heel-to-toe roll. It was a technique designed to mimic the weight of a stray animal. Every step was a gamble. If the sensors picked up a rhythmic human gait, the automated alarms would scream. The facility would lock down in less than 30 seconds. They reached the shadow of the primary transformer station. The hum of high-voltage electricity vibrated through the soles of their boots. The air here tasted like copper. One of the technical specialists knelt at the base of the control box. He pulled a fiber optic probe from his vest. He inserted the needle-thin camera into a seal in the casing. On his wrist-mounted screen, the internal circuitry appeared. He was looking for the heart of the security grid. He found the main bypass switch and attached a small magnetic device. The light on the magnetic device turned from red to a steady, pulsing green. The technical specialist looked at Volkov and gave a single, sharp nod. The electronic eyes of the NATO facility were now blind for a 90-second window. The cameras would show a looped image of a quiet, empty forest. The motion sensors would report nothing but the wind. Volkov pointed toward the massive bulk of the first ammunition vault. It was a mountain of reinforced concrete and earth, half buried in the ground. Inside that vault were the deep strike cruise missiles that NATO had moved to the border 3 days ago. The Spetsnaz team had 3 hours until dawn. If they were still inside the perimeter when the sun rose, they would be hunted down by 2 battalions of mechanized infantry. They sprinted toward the vault door. The wind picked up, howling through the steel girders of the loading docks. The sound masked their footsteps. They reached the heavy steel blast door. It was 4 inches of hardened steel, sealed by a biometric lock and a manual wheel. They were inside the heart of the base. The real work was about to begin. The silence of the night was heavy, but it was the silence of a fuse that had already been lit. 3:15 in the morning. The inner sanctum of the NATO facility. The Spetsnaz team slipped through the heavy blast door as it hissed shut behind them. The air inside was different. It was sterile, filtered, and smelled of ozone and industrial lubricant. The silence was absolute, broken only by the low-frequency hum of the ventilation fans. Red emergency floor lamps cast long, jagged shadows against the white concrete walls. Captain Volkov raised his hand. The team flattened against the corridor walls. 50 meters ahead, a robotic sentry drone moved on a ceiling track. It was a sleek, black shape, equipped with thermal optics and a suppressed machine gun. The lens of the drone swept left and right in a rhythmic, mechanical arc. The red glow of its sensor eye pulsed like a slow heartbeat. The operators remained motionless, their camouflage blending into the shadows of the utility pipes overhead. One of the Spetsnaz snipers raised his rifle. It was a VSS Vintorez, a weapon designed for total silence. He did not aim for the armor plating of the drone. He aimed for the exposed wiring harness near the drive motor. He squeezed the trigger. There was a faint puff of air, like a sharp exhale. The subsonic round struck the harness with a metallic click. The drone jerked once, its red eye flickering and then going dark. It hung limp on its track, a dead weight of steel and silicon. They moved forward in a low crouch. The floor was polished epoxy, designed to reveal even the smallest footprint. The team moved on the balls of their feet, avoiding the center of the hallway. They reached the first intersection. To the left lay the crew quarters and the security hub. To the right were the 3 primary ammunition magazines. Volkov pointed to the right. The mission was not to engage the garrison. The mission was to turn the millions of dollars of NATO ordnance into a mountain of scrap metal. The corridor opened into a massive loading bay. 4 heavy-lift forklifts stood idle near the center of the room. Stacked along the walls were hundreds of wooden and plastic crates. They were marked with yellow stencils. Javelin missiles. Stinger missiles. The smell of treated wood and fresh paint hung heavy in the cold air. Further back, in the reinforced concrete alcoves, were the big prizes. 6 Storm Shadow cruise missiles sat on hydraulic transport cradles. Each one was 5 meters long, a gray-skinned predator waiting for a war that would never come. The technical specialists moved toward the missiles immediately. They did not use standard plastic explosives. They used shaped thermite charges. These devices would not just blow up, they would burn at 4,000 degrees. The heat would melt through the missile casings and ignite the solid rocket fuel within. Once the propellant started to burn, no fire suppression system on Earth could stop it. The entire vault would become a furnace in less than 60 seconds. Volkov checked the time on his tactical watch. It was 3:22, but the tension in the room was rising. The air felt thick, charged with the weight of the explosives. He felt the vibration in the floor before he heard the sound. It was a rhythmic thudding. Boots on concrete. A NATO security detail was making an unscheduled round. The sound was coming from the security hub to the west. The Spetsnaz team dispersed into the shadows of the missile cradles. They vanished behind the steel struts and the heavy wooden crates. Volkov drew his combat knife. He did not want a gunshot to echo through the ventilation shafts. The footsteps grew louder. 2 voices were talking in low tones. They were speaking English. One was complaining about the cold. The other was laughing. Neither of them knew they were walking into a graveyard. The beam of a flashlight cut through the red gloom of the loading bay. It danced across the nose cone of a Storm Shadow missile. It moved toward the crate where Volkov was crouching. The light caught the edge of his boot for a fraction of a second. The footsteps stopped. The laughter died instantly. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Volkov gripped the handle of his knife until his knuckles turned white. The sound of a safety being clicked off echoed like a hammer strike in the silence. 3:23 in the morning. The primary loading bay. The NATO sentry did not have time to scream. Volkov lunged from the shadow of the missile cradle before the flashlight beam could center on his face. The heavy steel knife moved in a blurring arc through the red-tinted gloom. It found the narrow gap between the guard's tactical vest and his throat. The guard's eyes went wide, reflecting the dull red glow of the emergency lights as the life began to drain out of them. His rifle, a German-made G-36, slipped from his numb fingers. Volkov caught the weapon with his free hand before it could hit the epoxy floor. He clamped his palm over the man's mouth, stifling the final, wet gasp that bubbled from his throat. 10 feet away, the second sentry turned toward the sudden movement. He reached for the radio on his shoulder. He never touched it. A single 9mm round from a suppressed AS-Val rifle hissed through the air. The projectile punched through the center of the sentry's forehead. The back of his skull shattered against the concrete pillar behind him. Blood and gray matter sprayed in a fan-shaped pattern across the white-painted wall. The man slumped to the ground like a puppet with its strings cut. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic thud of his boots kicking the floor once, then twice, before falling still. Two Spetsnaz operators emerged from the darkness. They grabbed the bodies by the shoulders. They dragged them behind a stack of wooden crates filled with mortar rounds. The smell of fresh blood mixed with the chemical scent of floor wax and gun oil. Volkov wiped his blade on the dead man's uniform. He looked at his watch. 30 seconds had passed. The team did not wait. They moved toward the second set of blast doors at the far end of the bay. This was the deep storage vault. Inside were the high-explosive warheads for the tactical missile systems. The air grew colder as they descended further into the earth. The walls here were 6 feet of reinforced concrete, designed to withstand a direct nuclear strike. The hum of the base felt like a physical weight against their eardrums. The lead tech specialist reached the keypad of the second door. He did not try to hack the code. He pulled a small canister of liquid nitrogen from his pack. He sprayed the freezing liquid directly onto the electronic lock. The plastic and silicon turned brittle instantly. He struck the keypad with a heavy rubber mallet. The device shattered into 1,000 frozen fragments. He reached into the hole and pulled the manual override cable. The heavy steel gears groaned deep inside the wall. The door slid open, revealing a cavernous room filled with hundreds of tons of high explosives. Volkov stepped into the vault. The rows of olive drab crates stretched into the darkness. The scale of the facility was staggering. This was enough ammunition to level an entire city. Plant the charges, Volkov ordered with a sharp hand signal. The team moved with practiced efficiency. They placed the thermite blocks at the base of the primary support pillars. They wired the detonators to a single master clock. Every movement was deliberate. Every wire was checked twice. One of the operators paused. He pointed to the ceiling. The ventilation fans had stopped spinning. The hum had changed to a high-pitched whine. The base computer had detected the failure of the security drone in the hallway. The silent alarm was now active. In the security hub, the NATO officers were looking at dead screens and frozen sensors. They would realize the truth in less than 2 minutes. The window of stealth had slammed shut. 30 seconds to arm status, the technician whispered. He was sweat-streaked, his fingers moving rapidly over the detonator's touchscreen. Volkov stood near the door, his AK-12 rifle leveled at the corridor. He could hear the distant sound of heavy metal doors slamming shut. The lockdown had begun. The elevators were being cut. The stairwells were being sealed. The Spetsnaz team was now trapped inside the heart of the enemy fortress. The red lights in the vault began to pulse faster. A voice over the intercom began to speak in Polish and English. Intruder alert. Sector 4. All security teams to battle stations. Volkov did not flinch. He looked at his men. Their faces were masks of stone. The mission is the only thing that matters, Volkov said. The technician clicked the final switch. The master clock began to count down from 10 minutes. The fuse is lit, the technician said. Now we find a way out, or we burn with the rest of them. 3:25 in the morning. The interior of the deep storage vault. The heavy steel blast doors had locked with a mechanical thud that vibrated through the soles of their boots. Captain Volkov looked at the red strobe light pulsing above the exit. The internal defense system was fully engaged. The vault was now a pressurized tomb of reinforced concrete. Outside, the sound of heavy boots echoed through the metal ventilation grates. A platoon of NATO security forces was moving into tactical blocks. The air was freezing and tasted of dry ice and high-voltage electricity. The smell of ozone was so thick, it left a metallic tang on the back of Volkov's tongue. Volkov signaled to the back of the room. The team moved away from the primary doors. They found the service hatch hidden behind the third rack of Storm Shadow missiles. It was a narrow opening, coated in a layer of thick, black industrial grease. One by one, the 12 operators slid into the darkness of the maintenance tunnel. The tunnel was cramped and smelled of old oil and stagnant water. Above them, the heavy thrum of the base's backup generators grew louder. The sound was a rhythmic, pulsing roar that masked the scraping of their tactical gear. They crawled for 40 meters. The space was so tight that their tactical vests rubbed against the concrete ceiling. Dust fell into their eyes, stinging and gritty. The lead operator stopped at a heavy iron grate. He looked through the slats into the room below. They were looking down into the secondary motor pool. 6 armored transport trucks sat in the shadows. A NATO security team of 8 men was already there. They were moving in a professional diamond formation. Their weapons were leveled at the primary entrance of the motor pool. They did not expect the ceiling to open. Volkov tapped his radio twice. The team prepared their weapons. They switched from suppressed fire to full-velocity rounds. The time for silence had passed. The master clock on the explosives now read 7 minutes. The lead operator pushed the iron grate aside. He dropped 5 meters to the concrete floor. He landed in a crouch, his rifle already tracking the nearest target. The NATO guards spun around, their high-intensity flashlights cutting through the dark. The first burst of fire tore through the air. Tracer rounds streaked across the room in lines of brilliant white light. Sparks showered from the side of an armored truck as the bullets bit into the steel plating. The sound was a deafening hammer strike that echoed off the high walls. A NATO soldier was hit in the shoulder and spun around by the force of the impact. He fell behind a pile of tires, screaming for a medic. The air in the motor pool instantly filled with the acrid stink of burnt powder. Blue smoke curled around the overhead light fixtures. The Spetsnaz team poured out of the ceiling hatch. They moved like a single organism, covering every angle of the room. They used the heavy armored trucks as mobile cover. The NATO team retreated toward the main garage doors. They were pinned down by the superior volume of fire. Volkov saw his window. He pointed to the heavy transport truck at the end of the row. It was a 10-ton vehicle with a reinforced steel bumper. It was their ticket out of the facility. The technician jumped into the driver's seat. He did not use a key. He smashed the steering column and touched 2 wires together. The massive diesel engine roared to life with a cloud of black smoke. The sound drowned out the gunfire for a split second. Volkov climbed onto the running board, firing his rifle over the hood. The rest of the team scrambled into the back of the truck. The floorboards were cold and slippery with spilled diesel. The NATO soldiers at the garage doors ducked as the truck surged forward. The driver slammed the vehicle into gear. The tires shrieked on the epoxy floor, leaving black streaks of burnt rubber. They were moving at 40 kilometers per hour toward the reinforced exit. The air outside was still dark, but the horizon was beginning to glow with the first hint of gray. The clock was still ticking. Exactly 6 minutes remained before the vault became a sun. 3:26 in the morning. The heavy transport truck smashed through the inner security gate of the motor pool. The Spetsnaz team was now exactly 4 minutes away from the blast radius of a man-made volcanic eruption. The unanswered question was whether the reinforced steel of the 10-ton vehicle could survive the heavy weapons now traversing toward their position. The air outside the garage was a frozen mist of silver and gray, smelling of diesel exhaust and the sharp, metallic tang of the coming storm. The deck of the truck bed shuddered violently as the driver pushed the engine to its absolute limit. The truck surged onto the main perimeter road, its tires throwing up plumes of slush and gravel. NATO searchlights swung around from the watchtowers, bleaching the windshield white and blinding the driver for a split second. To the left, on the roof of a secondary barracks, a NATO security team scrambled into a firing position. They were hauling an AT-4 anti-tank weapon. The fiberglass tube leveled directly at the approaching grille of the truck. The NATO gunner squeezed the firing mechanism. The AT-4 anti-tank missile shrieked off the soldier's shoulder, a blinding white column of fire punching backward into the darkness of the rooftop. The heat blast scorched the concrete and sent a cloud of soot swirling into the freezing rain. The missile streaked across the 50-meter gap, a finger of light reaching for the truck's engine block with a high-pitched scream that tore through the wind. The warhead punched straight into the front grille of the 10-ton truck, detonating on the heavy steel engine block. The explosion erupted in a sphere of orange flame and jagged shrapnel that shredded the radiator and sent the heavy hood flying 30 meters into the air. The steering column shuddered with a force that nearly broke the driver's arms, and black, oily smoke boiled out of the twisted metal of the front end. The sound was a massive detonation that cracked the eardrums of the men in the back. followed by the hiss of escaping steam. The truck did not stop. Its massive momentum carried the burning wreck forward at 60 kilometers per hour. The driver fought the wheel, steering the flaming vehicle through the haze of smoke. In the back of the truck, Volkov and his men were thrown against the steel sideboards by the impact. The heat from the burning engine washed over the cabin, smelling of scorched paint and melted rubber. Volkov regained his footing, his eyes fixed on the final perimeter fence, still 200 meters away. "Return fire!" Volkov roared over the rush of the wind. The Spetsnaz operators leaned over the sides of the truck, their rifles spitting tongues of blue flame. They suppressed the rooftop position, forcing the NATO team to dive for cover behind the parapet. Tracers from the watchtowers began to stitch lines across the road, snapping past the truck like angry hornets. The truck was dying, the engine knocking with a rhythmic, metallic death rattle, but it was still moving. Behind them, deep in the earth of the ammunition vault, the digital timer was a silent witness to the carnage. The numbers flickered in the dark. 280 seconds. The fire from the thermite charges was already beginning to soften the steel casings of the cruise missiles. The air inside the vault was reaching 1,000 degrees. The primary magazines were beginning to groan under the pressure of expanding gases. The truck hit a patch of black ice and slid sideways, the rear tires spinning wildly before catching the gravel shoulder. The driver corrected the skid, his face illuminated by the fire burning under the shattered hood. They were approaching the outer gate. A pair of armored Humvees had moved into a V formation to block the exit. Their roof-mounted machine guns were already spinning, ready to shred the truck into 1,000 pieces of scrap. 3:27 in the morning. The outer perimeter gate. The burning transport truck roared toward the two NATO Humvees, blocking the only exit. The driver's hands were black with soot, his eyes squinting through the spiderweb of cracks in the windshield. The air was a freezing mix of diesel smoke and the sharp, metallic scent of ozone from the nearby power lines. The unanswered question was whether the truck would shatter against the armored V-shape of the blockade or punch through to the forest beyond. The NATO gunners behind the shielded M250 caliber machine guns did not hesitate. They opened fire at a range of 100 meters. Heavy slugs punched through the truck's radiator, sending geysers of white steam into the dark air. The rounds hammered against the steel frame with a sound like a giant sledgehammer hitting an anvil. Volkov leaned out of the passenger window, his teeth bared against the wind. He raised a Russian RPG-26 rocket launcher to his shoulder. The trigger was squeezed. The rocket shrieked off the launcher, a white column of fire punching backward through the cab of the truck. The heat blast washed across Volkov's face, smelling of chemical propellant and scorched hair. The smoke rose in a dense white cloud that blotted out the windshield for 3 full seconds. The projectile streaked across the gap, a line of light cutting through the freezing rain. The warhead punched clean through the engine block of the lead Humvee, detonating the fuel line instantly. The front of the vehicle lifted, straight off the ground. 4 tons of steel rose 2 meters before the chassis snapped, and the wreck fell back into the mud. A fireball erupted that bleached the sky white, sending jagged pieces of the hood flying into the trees. Black smoke boiled out of the crater, where the engine had been a second before. The second Humvee driver reacted in a blind panic. He kicked the floorboard and wrenched the steering wheel hard to the right. The vehicle slid sideways in the slush, the tires screaming for grip on the frozen gravel. It slammed into the concrete base of the guard shack, pinning the doors shut. The gunner was thrown from the turret, his body disappearing into the thick cloud of black smoke and steam. The NATO radio net erupted in overlapping voices, each one louder and more frantic than the last. Black smoke rose from the burning wreckage as the Spetsnaz truck slammed through the remaining gap. The metal-on-metal scream of the collision echoed across the facility. The truck's front axle groaned, but the momentum carried them past the burning Humvee. They were out. The dark wall of the forest rushed toward them, smelling of pine and wet earth. Behind them, the countdown reached exactly 0. The earth beneath the facility did not just shake. It heaved. The first thermite charges in the deep storage vault reached their peak temperature of 4,000 degrees. The steel casings of the Storm Shadow missiles turned to liquid. The solid rocket propellant ignited with the force of a small volcanic eruption. The pressure inside the sealed concrete bunker rose until the laws of physics could no longer contain it. The primary blast door, weighing 12 tons, was blown off. Its hinges. It flew 300 meters through the air, tumbling like a coin until it crushed a secondary barracks. A column of white and orange flame shot 500 feet into the night sky. The sound was a deep, guttural roar that rolled across the valley like a 20-plane, physical wave. The forest floor beneath the truck shuddered, nearly shaking the vehicle off the narrow dirt track. Volkov looked back through the shattered rear window. The entire NATO facility was now a silhouette against a wall of fire. Secondary explosions began to ripple through the underground magazines. Each one sent a new shockwave through the ground. The sky was no longer black. It was a bruised, angry purple, lit from below by the death of $1 billion of ordnance. The mission was a success, but the pursuit was only beginning. 3:28 in the morning. The edge of the Polish forest. The shockwave from the primary explosion caught the truck, 400 meters from the perimeter fence. A wall of compressed air and searing heat slammed into the rear of the vehicle. The heavy steel frame groaned under the sudden pressure. The remaining glass in the side windows shattered into a million sparkling diamonds. The smell of burnt plastic and ancient, disturbed dust filled the cabin. The driver fought the steering wheel as the truck fishtailed wildly in the freezing slush. 100 meters later, the engine gave a final, metallic scream and died. Volkov kicked the door open before the wheels had even stopped spinning. "Bail out! Into the tree line! Move!" The 12 operators rolled out of the truck bed. They hit the muddy ground and vanished into the darkness of the pines in seconds. Behind them, the transport truck was a mangled skeleton of black steel. The fire from the engine was a beacon for the NATO infrared sensors. They had to put distance between themselves and the road immediately. The forest was thick with ancient spruce and birch trees. The ground was a treacherous mix of moss, ice, and jagged rocks that threatened to snap an ankle with every step. The sky behind them was no longer dark. It was a pulsing, angry orange that cast long, flickering shadows deep into the woods. Secondary detonations continued to ripple through the valley. Each blast sent a fresh tremor through the earth. The sound was like a giant hammer hitting a hollow drum. The smell of the fire followed them. It was the scent of vaporized jet fuel, high explosives, and melting electronics. It was the smell of a mission accomplished, but the price of success was rising. Then came a new sound. It was a low, rhythmic thumping that vibrated in their chests. It was the sound of twin-engine rotors cutting through the heavy, wet air. 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters were low-leveling over the hills to the north. Their high-intensity searchlights slashed through the canopy like white blades. The beams caught the tops of the trees, turning the mist into a wall of blinding silver. The NATO Quick Reaction Force was on the hunt, and they were not looking for survivors. Thermal cloaks on, Volkov commanded in a harsh whisper. The operators pulled thin, metallic-lined sheets from their tactical packs. They draped the specialized fabric over their shoulders and equipment. The cloaks suppressed their body heat, making them invisible to the sophisticated infrared cameras mounted on the helicopters. They knelt in the shadows of massive, rotting roots. They became part of the landscape. The helicopters roared directly overhead, the downwash shaking the branches with violent force. Snow and frozen pine needles cascaded down on the team. The smell of kerosene exhaust hung in the air for a long, agonizing minute. The searchlights moved on, sweeping the road where the truck sat burning. Volkov checked his compass. The extraction point was 5 kilometers to the east, across a border that was now crawling with enemy patrols. The terrain was steep and broken by deep ravines. They had less than 2 hours before the sun stripped away their cover. The forest was alive with the sound of NATO soldiers now, He could hear the distant, frantic barking of tracking dogs. The hunters were closing the circle. The Spetsnaz team began to move again, faster this time. They did not use the trails. They moved through the thickest brush, where the thorns tore at their uniforms. They were ghosts in a burning world, and the forest was their only ally. 3:50 in the morning. The deep ravine, 2 miles east of the facility. The 12 Spetsnaz operators moved through the frozen creek bed, their boots crunching on thin layers of black ice. The forest here was a maze of fallen timber and jagged limestone ridges. The air was thick with the smell of wet pine and the sharp iron scent of the tracking dogs closing the gap from the west. The unanswered question was how many NATO fire teams were leapfrogging through the hills to cut them off. Volkov raised a hand. The team froze instantly. Behind them, the barking of the Belgian Malinois tracking dogs reached a fever pitch. The sound echoed off the stone walls of the ravine, making it impossible to pinpoint the exact distance. But Volkov didn't need his ears. He had the thermal scan. 300 meters back, 5 heat signatures were moving fast. They were light infantry, stripped of heavy gear for maximum speed. They were the hunters. Ambush positions, Volkov signaled. The operators didn't speak. They melted into the shadows of the ravine walls. 2 snipers climbed the slippery rocks to the rim, their suppressed rifles leveled at the creek entrance. The rest of the team lay flat behind moss-covered boulders. The forest was deathly silent for 3 long minutes. The only sound was the wind whistling through the spruce needles and the distant, muffled thud of secondary explosions still rocking the valley. The first NATO soldier appeared at the mouth of the ravine. He was moving in a low crouch, his G-36 rifle scanning the darkness. Behind him, a handler struggled to restrain a lunging tracking dog. The animal's breath came in white clouds, its eyes fixed on the exact spot where Volkov was hiding. The dog knew. It bared its teeth and let out a low, guttural growl that vibrated in the cold air. Volkov waited until all 5 soldiers were deep inside the kill zone. He clicked his tongue once. The 2 snipers on the ridge opened fire simultaneously. The subsonic rounds hissed through the air like angry snakes. The NATO lead scout was hit in the chest and thrown backward into the freezing water of the creek. The dog handler fell a second later, a single round shattering his collarbone. The tracking dog erupted in a frenzy of barking, snapping at the air as its master went down. The remaining 3 NATO soldiers dove for cover behind a fallen birch tree. They opened fire blindly, the muzzle flashes lighting up the ravine in strobes of brilliant white. The sound of the unsuppressed rifles was deafening in the narrow space. Bullets chipped the limestone, sending shards of rock flying like shrapnel. The acrid stink of burnt powder filled the ravine in seconds. "Flank them," Volkov ordered. 2 Spetsnaz operators surged forward from the left, staying low in the shadows of the rocks. They tossed 2 flashbang grenades over the fallen birch. The twin detonations bleached the ravine white and hammered the eardrums of everyone inside. The NATO soldiers were blinded, their rifles falling silent as they clutched their faces. The Spetsnaz team moved in to finish the engagement. It was over in 10 seconds. The ravine returned to its heavy, frozen silence. The only thing left was the sound of the wind and the soft splashing of the creek over the rocks. The tracking dogs were gone. The pursuit was silenced, for now. Volkov checked his watch. 4:15. The extraction helicopter was exactly 4 kilometers away, but the sky was starting to change. The deep black was turning to a pale, ghostly blue. The sun was coming, and with it, the full weight of the NATO Air Force. "Move," Volkov said, his voice a rasp in the cold. "We have 20 minutes to reach the ridge, or we don't go home at all." 4:20 in the morning. The granite ridge overlooking the valley. The Spetsnaz team reached the crest just as the ground beneath their boots began to liquefy. Captain Volkov did not look back until he felt the static electricity crawl across his skin, making the hair on his arms stand straight up. The unanswered question was whether the massive underground secondary magazines would merely burn, or if they would take the entire mountain with them. The air was a freezing vacuum 1 second and a searing furnace the next, smelling of pulverized concrete and ancient burnt earth. The secondary magazines, buried 60 feet below the Polish soil, finally reached the critical flash point. 6,000 tons of high explosives, cruise missile fuel, and white phosphorus ignited in a single microsecond. A dome of white light, brighter than any sun, expanded from the center of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization facility. The light was so intense it bleached the world, of all color, turning the forest, the sky, and the mountains into a flat, silver photograph. There was a moment of absolute, terrifying silence that lasted for 3 full heartbeats. Then, the shockwave hit. The blast wave tore through the valley like a physical hand, snapping thousand-year-old pines, like dry kindling for miles in every direction. The sound was not a bang. It was a deep, guttural roar that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly into the bone marrow of every man on the ridge. The pressure slammed into the Spetsnaz team, throwing them forward, into the mud. Volkov felt the air being sucked out of his lungs as the vacuum followed the blast. The heat was a physical blow, a wall of energy that smelled of scorched stone and ionized air. A mushroom cloud of black smoke and orange fire roiled upward, punching through the low-hanging clouds. Jagged chunks of the facility's reinforced concrete roof, some the size of main battle tanks, were sent flying, 2,000 feet into the air. They fell back to Earth like a rain of meteors, crushing the remains of the perimeter fences and the secondary barracks. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization facility was gone. It was not just destroyed, it was erased from the map, replaced by a smoking crater of fused glass and twisted rebar. Up! Get up! Volkov roared, though he could not hear his own voice, over the ringing in his ears. His lungs burned with every breath of the chemical-laden air. He grabbed the nearest operator by the tactical vest and hauled him to his feet. The sky was raining ash and glowing embers that hissed as they hit the melting snow. The valley below was a hellscape of secondary fires and exploding fuel trucks. To the north, the 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters that had been hunting them were caught in the turbulence of the explosion. One of the aircraft was slammed sideways by the wall of air, its tail rotor snapping as it collided with a falling piece of debris. The helicopter spun out of control, a trailing ribbon of fire, marking its path until it slammed into the hillside and erupted in a fresh fireball. The second helicopter banked hard, its pilot fighting the controls to stay in the sky. The searchlights were gone. The hunters were now just trying to survive the storm. The extraction point. 200 meters, Volkov signaled, his hand shaking from the adrenaline. They ran along the spine of the ridge. The ground was still trembling, a rhythmic thumping that felt like the heartbeat of a dying giant. The smell of the blast followed them, a thick, suffocating mix of cordite and burnt rubber. Every man was covered in a layer of gray ash, their faces masks of soot and sweat. Through the haze of smoke and falling debris, a low, dark shape emerged from the eastern tree line. It was a Russian Mi-8 MTV-5 transport helicopter, running without lights. Its heavy rotors were already biting into the thin, cold air, creating a swirl of snow and ash. The side door was open. A gunner was braced behind a Cord 12.7mm machine gun, his eyes scanning the burning valley below. The extraction was here. Volkov looked back one last time at the inferno they had created. The mission was a total success. The ammunition depot was a memory. But the sun was finally breaking over the horizon, and the entire North Atlantic Treaty Organization Air Command would be descending on this coordinate in minutes. They had cheated death in the vault, in the motor pool, and on the road. Now, they just had to get off the ground. 5 in the morning, the Granite Ridge. The Mi-8 transport helicopter was already hovering 3 feet off the frozen ground, its heavy rotors screaming against the thin mountain air. The unanswered question was whether the Russian pilot could hold the aircraft steady long enough for 12 men to board while the valley below erupted in a fresh wave of NATO anti-aircraft fire. The air was a chaotic swirl of freezing snow, gray ash, and the sharp, chemical sting of kerosene exhaust. Volkov pushed the first 2 men toward the open side door, his boots slipping on the blood-slicked metal of the boarding step. The Mi-8 bucked violently as a secondary shockwave from the facility hit the ridge. The pilot fought the collective, the engines groaning under the strain of the high-altitude hover. To the west, the surviving NATO MH-60 helicopter was banking hard for a final attack run. It was less than 2 kilometers away, its nose-mounted sensor ball locked onto the heat signature of the extraction bird. The sun was now a sliver of cold gold on the horizon, illuminating the smoke columns that stretched for miles across the Polish countryside. "Get in! Move! Move!" Volkov shouted, grabbing the shoulder of the last technician and throwing him into the dark interior of the cabin. The Spetsnaz gunner behind the Cord 12.7mm machine gun opened fire. The heavy weapon hammered out a rhythmic, bone-shaking beat that drowned out the wind. Tracer rounds the size of fingers zipped into the tree line, shredding the pine branches where a NATO fire team was trying to set up a shoulder-fired missile. Across the floorboards, Volkov was the last man on the ground. He lunged for the handle of the sliding door just as the pilot pulled pitch. The helicopter surged upward, the sudden G-force pinning Volkov against the frame. He scrambled inside, sliding across the metal floor. As the door hissed shut and locked, the cabin was a tomb of exhausted men, their faces caked in gray soot, their eyes hollow and staring. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the roar of the twin turbines and the whistling of the wind through the bullet holes in the fuselage. The Mi-8 dove off the edge of the ridge, dropping into the deep shadows of the eastern valley to mask its radar profile. The pilot pushed the aircraft to its structural limit, the airframe vibrating with a violent, high-frequency shudder. Behind them, a pair of NATO F-16 fighters screeched across the sky at 20,000 feet, their afterburners 2 points of orange light against the blue morning. But they were looking for a high-altitude target. The Mi-8 was a ghost, hugging the contours of the jagged rocks, flying so low that the rotor wash flattened the grass in the mountain meadows. 10 minutes later, the vibration in the floor began to smooth out. The pilot's voice crackled over the internal intercom. "Border crossing in 60 seconds. We are clear of the engagement zone." A collective exhale moved through the cabin. The tension did not disappear, but it shifted from the sharp edge of survival to the heavy weight of exhaustion. One of the operators reached into his vest and pulled out a battered flask. He took a swallow and passed it to the man next to him. Volkov crawled toward the small, reinforced window in the rear of the cabin. He looked back toward the west. The Polish forest was a sea of deep green, but in the center of the valley, a massive scar of black earth and white smoke marked the place where the depot had stood. The fire was still visible, a pulsing orange glow that looked like a wound in the earth. The NATO deep strike capability in this sector had been neutralized. The mission was a total success. The helicopter climbed into a bank of thick, gray clouds, the world outside turning into a featureless white void. The smell of the fire and the copper taste of the blood finally began to fade, replaced by the sterile scent of the aircraft's oxygen system. Volkov leaned his head against the cold vibration of the hull and closed his eyes. The silence of the high-altitude flight was absolute. The raid was over. The war, however, was only beginning.